Corey Sprengel is our seminar speaker tonight. Corey's a Ranger Boat Pro, and he's brought here tonight by our two sponsors, Ranger Boats and Moorhead Marine. A lot of us here in Fargo-Moorhead recognize the dominance of the NDSU football team, right? 5 national championships in a row, just dominating their competition. That was the best analogy I could think of to Corey here, because this gentleman at 28 years old, with 8 years of professional angling experience, has more tournament wins, and I'm talking national big-time tournament wins, and top 10 finishes than most pros accumulate in a lifetime. This guy is the Tiger Woods of professional walleye fishing. So it's a real treat to have someone like that with us tonight. And just to looking at his resume, he had a list of top 10 and championship finishes that's about as long as your arm. I mean, it was very impressive to look. And that includes 2013 being the National Walleye Tour Tournament Champion in events at Red Wing and Sturgeon Bay. He was the National Walleye Tour tied for the Angler of the Year in the season points that year as well, and came in first in season points in the MWC. That's in one season. That's pretty impressive. He followed that up the next year by a National Walleye Tour Championship and a World Walleye Championship. These are just a few of the highlights. It is incredible to see what this individual has done. He's going to be telling us tonight and informing us a little bit about using today's electronics and technology. So without further ado, I am going to welcome Corey Sprengel to FM Walleyes Unlimited.
Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Just take a second here. Alright, we'll get started. First of all, I'm just do a little bit of a background. Like he said, I'm 28 years old and I'm from Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, so it was about an 8-hour trip on the way here today and through a snowstorm and ice storm, but made it here just fine. And just another reason I got to North Dakota, and I would love to live here someday. The sun was shining, there wasn't any snow on the ground, and didn't see any snow geese or any waterfowl or anything like that. It would have made it even sweeter. But no, I just love the outdoors and love tournament fishing, and just love fishing in the outdoors, hunting, duck hunting especially, and chasing deer. And thank you all for coming here tonight. And one of the things I really like to talk about and really emphasize a lot is electronics, what we're going to talk about tonight, because I can probably reassure you that pretty much every angler in this room knows how to catch fish about 99% of the time. Once we're on top of fish, it's pretty easy to catch them most of the time. And the biggest thing and the biggest challenge for most of us is just finding those fish. For a weekend angler, tournament angler, anything, time comes down to the biggest thing that limits us on how many fish we're going to catch. The more fish we can be on top of, or the faster we can find those fish, the more fish we're going to catch at the end of the day. So one thing that's what I'm going to talk about today is using electronics and how to utilize electronics, very efficiently, so you can cover water fast and find fish fast and eliminate structure or big pieces of structure and really find those key areas, and how to utilize structure scan and side scan and down scan technologies. And so that's one thing we're going to talk about today. And I get the question often asked a lot of times, and how I got started tournament fishing and how I've had so much success throughout the years at such a young age. And the biggest tool that I can say that I rely on to really equal the playing field on some of the veterans that have been to a lot of these bodies of water many times, when most of the time it's my first time there, is my electronics. I use my electronics, more often than I'm fishing most days in practice. A lot of bodies of water I go to, I might drive around for 4 or 5 hours without wetting line and just strictly using electronics, finding the fish, marking them out on my unit, and so I can go back to them and check them, closer to the tournament. And that's some things we're going to talk about today. But one of the biggest things that really started me when I was younger was I loved to fish when I was younger. I grew up in a town in Fox Lake, Wisconsin, which is about 10 miles from where I live now, and I had a lake there and had a river that ran through it. And I rode my bike to the dam every day, went out fishing on the lake, any shore spot I could pick, and I just loved fishing. I fell in love with it on TV, and it was just kind of in my blood. My parents didn't fish. My dad now travels with me as a co-angler on the National Walleye Tour, so I get to spend a lot of time with him now. But there's actually an older gentleman in town when I was about 12, 13 years old. You know, lived 2 blocks from me, and he had just retired at 55, and you know, loved fishing just as much as I did, and fish. Older, correct, yeah, he's an older gentleman, and he's kind of the one that took me under his wing and took me out fishing in the boat, so I get offshore. And he was a diehard fisherman and a very well-known fisherman in my area. And he's kind of the one that started in my head when I was younger. You know, not only are we catching fish in this spot, but this is why we're catching fish here. And if they're not here right now, this is where they might be or where they might be coming from, kind of thing. So it got me started when I was younger. You know, thinking about the things. When I am catching fish, this is why. And, you know, and that enabled me to, realize, why I was catching them, why they were there, and be able to duplicate them no matter where I went. So that's just a cool little thing is, taking the youth fishing and, keeping the next generation coming up in the fishing industry. It's really cool to see a lot on tour now, more and more younger guys starting to participate, and it's a really cool thing to see. And it's always fun to see a smile on a kid's face when he pulls a big fish in. But we'll get started here. At any time, if anyone has any questions, I'll save about every 15 minutes or so between slides. I'll ask her some questions on some key things. If you could just save them till then. So we're going to start talking about today's electronics. First, I'm going to go through the benefits. Is that screen in the way?
Don't worry about it.
Go through the benefits of electronics, and I'll go into just some mapping features and some key little points that I like to talk about and utilize. And then we'll go into traditional sonar, your 2-dimensional sonar that most of us are familiar with, and that probably most of us have on our boats. And I really want to go through that and emphasize how that works, because when we start talking about structure scan and side scan and different things, you really need to understand how both of them work to really understand how to utilize both of them, because some of them have key features that work better than others, and there's going to be times when some unit or the 2-dimensional sonar is going to mark a fish that the down scan or side scan does not. So it's one of those things to really be able to understand both of them to really understand what your unit is telling you. So we get started here with some of the benefits. The biggest thing is just eliminate water without fishing. If we can have that trust in our electronics to really have that grasp that if I'm not marking anything, this is not telling me that there's any fish here, just to drop it and go on to the next spot and fish when you do see fish. Because when you do see fish, right away you know where they are, if they're suspended in the water column, if they're halfway down, if they're towards bottom, or even what presentation you use. If there's a lot of rocks around, a lot of wood around, it just helps you eliminate a lot of water fast without fishing, is utilizing those electronics to help you make the best decision. And another big thing is, especially with side scan, finding that spot on a spot. You could have a lot of big structure, big points. There's a lot of big points that are on a lot of bodies of water that are not very good, and there's a lot of reasons behind that. They may just be big sand points with no rocks on them. They could be huge long points, but there's only a little rock pile in a certain area. Utilizing side scan, it makes it very easy to find exactly where those spots are, covering 160 feet or 180 feet at a time. So it's one of those things where you can cover a lot of water and find those real particular small spots that hold fish a lot of times. And the biggest thing is understanding why fish are there, and using those electronics to give you every piece of printed information that you could have. A lot of times on regular sonar, things are kind of hard to understand when you're painting a picture straight down. When you start talking in side scan, when you're pushing off to each side of the boat and printing a nice laid out picture of what's down there, it's a lot easier to visualize what is really going on down there instead of just a top view of it. Like I said before, it helps you. Especially on the Great Lakes, not so much on a lot of lakes around here, but if fish are suspended, a lot of big bodies of water, especially Lake Winnebago, the Great Lakes, Mille Lacs, even Leech Lake, and a lot of your bigger bodies of water that have shad in them or anything like that, fish love to suspend, especially your biggest fish. There's been plenty of times, Lake Winnebago especially, Badenoch, Green Bay, there's times when you're only fishing 5 feet down over 30, 40 feet of water. And that's just where those fish are cruising, especially when it's calmer conditions out there. The bugs are on the surface, the bait fish are up by the bugs, and the fish are right below them. So it's one of those things, is utilizing your sonar to understand where the fish are, especially when you start getting into some deeper water situations. And what it also tells you is, when you know there's fish there, if you have the wrong color on, you're just not catching them, it makes that decision easy when you know that they're there, and maybe it's a different presentation that you need to utilize. So this picture right here is just my setup that I have in my Ranger. Just shows how important electronics are to me. Now, these are two 12-inch screens. They're pretty big screens, but this is typically how I set my boat up for split screen versions on my Ranger here. On the top side here, I have a split screen with sonar in my mapping unit, and this is typically what I run on most bodies of water. On my bottom unit, I have my side imaging and down scan. But a lot of times when I go to new bodies of water, like I was in Kansas last year for a tournament down there, a lot of times I'll actually take two mapping chips, because with Lawrence we can put two map cards in at the same time and utilize them both on the screen. I'll split this two ways here and have two map chips, because most of us know that not every lake chip is perfect, and some have benefits in certain areas where other ones lack. And so I'll actually split two mapping units. I'll have my down scan, maybe split right here, and I'll have my two-dimensional sonar here. But I always like to have my side scan with at least a half of my screen, because with side scan, the bigger the screen gets, the lot easier it is to see. Like when we get into some slides later, but you can see here I'm going out 100 feet each way. So there's 100 feet of bottom right here, and so that's a pretty condensed area for 100 feet worth of information to be printed. So I want to have the biggest screen that I can, especially with side scan, to utilize to see those small little features, and which I'll get into later. But this just shows the importance of, for me, tournament fishing, if it's a weekend angler, just how important electronics are to me. I can stand back far at the boat and I can still see my trails if I'm trolling or anything like that. So it's just one of those things where, to me, it's leveled the playing field for the number of years that I've lacked on tour to help me catch up with some of the older guys. So right away with mapping, briefly go over that. Biggest thing is, having a good lake chip to, basically keep safety, especially on a lot of the Great Lakes or even other bodies of water. There's places out on Green Bay, Bay de Noc, where you can be 10 miles offshore, and there's shoals that come up to 2 or 3 feet or less a lot of times, and now they might be even out of the water, and there's a buoy 4 miles this way, and there's a buoy 3 miles that way, and there's nothing where the shallow water is. And so it's one of those things where knowing what's underneath the boat a lot of times helps you with safety, but what it also does, eliminates a lot of the guesswork. It helps you be more precise right off the bat, where you kind of have an understanding what you're trolling towards or what you're fishing. And so having a good, precise lake chip or multiple different lake chips really helps speed up that process. And a big thing in using your mapping is speed. If it's pulling bottom bouncers, if it's trolling lead core especially, that's very speed depending. Knowing your speed down to 1/10 of a mile an hour is a big thing. Especially, like I said, trolling lead core or spinners where 1/10 of a mile an hour could be, 2 or 3 feet deeper, 2 or 3 feet shallower. And what I like to do is always keep an eye on that speed, no matter what I'm doing, because it changes often. Because I want to get that feel for my boat, especially if I'm using a Minn Kota pulling with my bow mount, kind of get that feel for this power is moving my boat at this speed, because a lot of times it doesn't matter what body of water, there's a lot of current in most bodies of water, especially the big bodies of water. And that current can be up to a half mile an hour or more a lot of times, especially on the Great Lakes. And so having that feel for your boat and really understanding at this speed on my bow mount, I should be going about roughly this speed with this kind of wind, and because that can dictate a lot. Like I said, if that current's moving at a couple 1/10 of a mile an hour, and I'm trying to keep my speed at 1 mile an hour, but the current's moving a few miles an hour, and I only have my bow mount barely moving, and I'm going as fast as I want to be going. What that's doing is I'm moving with the current, and say if I'm trolling spinners, those spinners with those weights are going to be plowing a lot deeper than they would be, because there's a lot less resistance because I'm moving with the water. So having that feel and understanding currents, that might be around you if it's Devil's Lake, with a lot of neck down areas. There's current a lot of times, and that's what gets the fish going a lot of times when there is that current. One of the biggest eye-opening experiences was probably about 5-6 years ago on Green Bay. It was a flat, calm day out on Green Bay. There's an island out there with a long sandbar that runs out past it, just out in the middle of nowhere, 4 or 5 miles offshore. It was flat, calm. There was about 2 foot, basically 2 foot rapids going over top of that sandbar. And it was flat, calm, but there was that much current, basically residing back from the day before. It was a strong south wind a few days before that, pushed a lot of water up, and it was all coming back down. But it was flat, calm, but the current was screaming, over a half mile an hour, and that's a big deal, especially when you're talking about you're only trolling 1 mile an hour, and a lot of times when you're pulling spinners. So it's really having that feel for your boat and understanding, down to a 1/10 of a mile an hour and how fast you're really going. The biggest thing we all know is utilizing waypoints. I got a few tips to talk about those, but waypoints are just one of those things where I use a lot of waypoints. I probably have close to 10,000 waypoints saved over the years, and I save them for every body of water. It's just one of those things where, I don't want to lose that information. If I marked it, I got a quick little note here on the next slide on how to keep track of a lot of those waypoints so you understand, what waypoint 5200 means. And we'll talk about that. And trails are a big thing. It doesn't matter what tournament it is. I change my trail in practice every day. Every day I change it. When I'm ice fishing, I change my trails every couple days, so I kind of have an idea on where I was or where I was crossing cracks at or which way the fish are moving. But trails are a very important tool, which I'll talk about too. Like I said, the lake chip is probably the one the biggest tools that we can use. There's multiple different manufacturers out there, and they all have their pluses. What we have here is on the Lowrance screen. A lot of the talk I'm going to talk about here in this seminar is based off of Lowrance. That's just what I use and I'm familiar with. A lot of other companies have some of the same technology out there, but this is mostly going to be on Lowrance. So you can see here, this is a waypoint screen pulled up off my Lowrance here, and it's waypoint number 1897. And this waypoint here is actually from Devil's Lake. You can see here, I actually picked this icon here, which is the money symbol. It was an excellent walleye spot in the evening for ice fishing. Just one of those things that it helps me, kind of distinguish from one thing to the next. But what it has here on the Lowrance, and what it allows us to do is by simply clicking on the waypoint, is it pulls up this little note category. Now, when you start to get a lot of waypoints built up on your Lowrance, and they start to kind of all blend together, and after about a couple of years, you forget what half of them mean. This little note catalog or little note area here with the new touchscreen units, it's just like texting. I could simply text in here. This was a culvert in 8 feet of water. It was where I was catching a lot of walleyes each evening when I was out fishing on Devil's Lake. But it's just one of those things where it helps distinguish. We always have the time and the date down there on the bottom from when it was from. So it's just one of those things that helps us distinguish multiple waypoints very easily. This next slide here is just changing trails. This is actually out ice fishing as well. Every couple days changing trails, but what it allows me to do is instead of putting down a ton of waypoints, what I can do is I can use these trails to, if I was crossing a crack or if there was a trail that I was taking through deep snow, a lot of times I can follow that same trail. But what it also does is different days, instead of putting in a ton of waypoints, I can see where I was drilling holes where I was moving. One day there was fish right here. A couple days later they moved down in here. And as we kind of lost them a little bit, we ended up catching them back over here again. But what it did is instead of putting down just a ton of waypoints where I was drilling holes and where I was catching fish, I knew the area that I was previously, very easily by the different colors that I was using. So to help me eliminate water, I kind of had an idea which way I was moving each day, and just not based off of waypoints. The same thing in the summer. I know where I've been, I know where I've gone through, if it's a safety area where I was cutting across or anything like that. It kind of helps me eliminate water without using a lot of waypoints. Here's another great slide. This is actually, from another tournament actually that I won. I think there might be a club member here that may have weighed like 34 pounds for that tournament. I think Troy Morris thought he was going to win, but I had something else to say about that. And so what this is, instead of, basically instead of looking at contour lines on my graph or utilizing my electronics, this is only a 20-foot area here, so wide these trails here, but it's a lot easier for me to see that trail when I'm standing in the back of my boat, looking forward at my electronics, seeing that big bright path that's on my electronics to understand where I need to turn left, where I need to turn right, instead of trying to, look at those contour lines and go back to my rods. So, it's very easy to duplicate an area, having those trails that you have beat down on there. A lot of people just, keep the same trail, over and over until it keeps deleting. And, it's very important to, save those trails, from previous, because there's times when, you might have just cut over, maybe it's 30 feet, 30 feet deeper, 30 feet shallower, and you don't quite notice that. And, a few days later, you're like, why am I not catching them? But all your trails are either deleted or they're all blended together because they're all the same color, and it's hard to distinguish, where you might have been. So changing colors and changing those trails up to really understand, where you're fishing and how to be a little bit more precise is a lot easier. Here's another one that you guys might be familiar with. It's just one of those things where it's a very narrow band, and using those electronics, it's a lot easier with those trails to duplicate that same area over and over again. Here's just another quick little screenshot of just comparing, a Navionics waypoint to another Lake Shark waypoint side by side, which we can do on the Lowrance units. I do a lot of times, especially on bodies of water with a lot of structure. It's so nice to be able to compare two because they're usually not all the same, especially when it gets to bigger bodies of water and especially the Great Lakes. So next thing we're going to get into is talking about traditional sonar and how it works and the pros and cons to it and what I like to utilize it for, because it's always that, I always like to have a good base, that you're familiar with when it comes to talking with electronics that you're unfamiliar with. So the biggest thing with traditional sonar is understanding the frequencies that it uses. Your traditional sonar generally uses 200 kilohertz, which is a little bit narrower band. Then it uses 83 kilohertz or sometimes even 50 kilohertz. Those 83 kilohertz is just a little bit bigger cone than the 200 is. It has basically a broader area, but most of the time when we're talking about sonar, bigger areas and bigger areas of coverage is actually worse for your electronics than it is for good. Because the bigger area you're covering, now you're starting to pick up a high spot over here or a rock way over here, and maybe a fish over here, and it has to blend it all into one big picture, one flat picture. And when it's picking out high spot over here, high spot over there, it blends it all together, and it's going to pick the highest spot is what it's going to call bottom, and everything below it is gone. It's going to be in the bottom. And so the bigger, broader areas has a lot less detail because it's covering a bigger area. But what it is good for is, say, if you're open water fishing on a lot of flats, and especially deep water, that when the fish are suspended and relating the bottom is not a big issue, you're going to cover a lot more water than you would with your 200 kilohertz. But most of the time, I'm typically running, I'd say 99% of the time, I run 200 kilohertz. Just because that's what I'm familiar with. I know what a fish looks like at 200 kilohertz because when you go to that 83 kilohertz, that fish is going to be in that cone for a lot longer. So it's going to be a lot more sweeping of an arc than it is with a smaller cone of 200 kilohertz. So understanding a lot of things, I have some screenshots that will show a lot of this. So we have a lot bigger coverage with 83 kilohertz, but it has a lot less detail than you would with the 200 kilohertz. And this starts to make a lot more sense when you start talking about structure scan. Biggest thing also that has a great pro about traditional sonars, it works well fast. We can go 50, 60 miles an hour with two-dimensional sonar, we can read bottom just fine. You can see fish down there, you can see when bottom changes very easily. Where down scan, moving that fast, everything is condensed because it's such a narrow band that it's tough to see things. You can read bottom and everything that fast, but it doesn't pick up as great as traditional sonar would. Typically on Lowrance units, I run the auto sensitivity on most of the time, and I usually scale it back to -2, sometimes even -3 to eliminate some of the clutter that's in there, especially with some dirty water lakes. That auto feature, adjusts it, by itself all the time. It just scaled back a little bit compared to the auto setting, basically auto being 0. And traditional sonar, same with most other sonar. Keep an eye on that water temperature. Water temperature is always a big thing, especially early in the year, and then again late in the year. And even the Great Lakes, it's even more of a big deal when water temperature can change just by the which way the wind blows. It can drop 10 degrees in a couple hours just because it's blowing offshore compared to the day before when it was blowing onshore. So keep an eye on that water temperature. It can tell you whether or not you need to get out of there or even stay there. So it's great for covering water, especially basin trolling. It's a great baseline when it comes to understanding when you're using your structure scan. So just one of those things, I have some screenshots here that really show how both of those work. So what do you have here? The first one I'm going to start off with is just kind of what I'm talking about. So right below your boat here, say this is your boat, your transducer is mounted right on your transom here. So this would be your two-dimensional sonar. Nice big cone that you have here, covers a lot of bottom, a lot of area, which is great for some things, but not most. Well, now when you start talking about downscan, I'll show this same slide here, but downscan is a very narrow sliver, so it paints a very clear picture, almost picture-like picture, what is straight below the boat. It's not getting something that's in front of you, it's not getting something that's behind you, it's getting something that's right below the boat. So it can paint a nice, very clear picture. Here's a little bit different slide of kind of the same thing. Like I was talking about, your 200 kilohertz is a smaller band, straight below the boat. 83 is a lot bigger. And when you start talking about side scan, I'll show you the same one as well, but this is the 455, and off both sides, it shows it, a little bit different than what it is. I think it's a little bit closer to the middle than what they show here, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this next slide here is what I like to talk about. It really helps you understand how a fish marks and how your transducer echo is read on your unit. So what we have here is basically we have the water surface up top here, and this would be your bottom, or any kind of lake bottom or anything like that. So the shortest distance traveled is the first thing, so basically straight below the boat. Straight down is going to be the shortest distance, and that's what your unit is going to call bottom. That's what it's going to read as your depth. Now, say your transducer cone goes over to this 40 line, and this 40 line is your transducer cone. Going at these diagonals, it has a lot more to travel, which is going to be, considered deeper on your unit. And that's how a fish gets marked, which I'll have on the next slide here. So when a fish comes into a mark, that fish might be at this height right here, but when that fish comes in right here, it's got greater distance to travel, so that's why it starts to show an arc. As it gets straight under the boat, it has less distance to travel, that's why it shows as it comes up. As it leaves the underneath of the boat, it gets further away, or not further away from the, well, technically further away from the boat, but that transducer has a lot longer range to cover. And the same thing comes into fact when you start talking about brake lines. You can see here, let's say this bottom is coming up like it is here. Now say this bottom comes sweeping up right here, it's a very steep brake line. Now if this bottom comes right here, this is going to probably be the shortest distance traveled. So if it goes up a brake line, the first thing that hits bottom and returns back to the transducer is what it's going to call bottom. Now this could keep tapering off here to deeper water, but the first thing that it considers bottom might be the edge of the cone. And that's what it's going to tell you is bottom, and it's not going to show anything below it. So all those fish or anything that's below that cone is going to be hidden or going to be gone, or it's going to, sometimes you can pick it up in your bottom if there's a fish down there or something like that, but it's hidden in the bottom. So a lot of times when I'm fishing steep brake lines or anything like that, I don't like to troll along them a lot of times. I like to basically go 90 degrees to them, troll into them, troll up them, turn back around and go back down them. So you're kind of covering the whole brake line at once instead of just one spot if you're going alongside of it. Because if you're going alongside the brake line, you're just picking up that shallowest spot that your transducer cone is hitting and nothing deeper, just that shallow side. So it's one thing to understand on how that transducer echo returns back to that transducer to show what a fish is and also structure. So now what we have here is basically, this is your bottom. The hardest return on this color palette, it would be the yellow. The hardest return that echoes back. If you have the bottom that comes up here, now like I was saying, this is a fish here. So as that fish starts coming into the cone, it shows as if it's a little bit further away. And as it gets straight underneath the boat, this would be the top of it. As it leaves the boat, it leaves this echo. And that's what creates that fish hook that a lot of us see on our graphs a lot of times. And that's how a fish is marked. What I always like to keep in mind when I'm trying to understand, if this is a big fish or how big this fish is the color return that it shows in it. The hardest bottom in this color palette is yellow, like I said. I have some yellow in this fish right here and have a lot of orange. But another great way to check, so there's a pretty dense return here. What I also like to check too is the height of this mark here. There's a pretty tall height in there. It's a pretty big return and mark. Which shows a pretty large fish. This is a very big fish. It's actually on the Lake Oahe system here. But another huge thing to keep in mind, especially when you're talking about fish marks and different things, is keep an eye at the depth of the water you're at. So now we're in 16 foot here, so relatively shallow. But so we have 16 feet of water that's in this screen right here. So this fish right here, say we're in twice as deep. This fish is going to be half as small because you have twice as much water in that same picture here. So if we're in 30 feet of water, this fish will be about half the size it was because everything else is going to be condensed. Another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the size of fish and things we're marking is our speed. This dictates how long a fish is going to mark on your unit because it's how long you're going to be over top of them. So understanding how fast you're going compared to the speed that you're going really helps you understand the size of the fish or what you are marking. So it's one thing to always keep in mind. This next slide here is another great example. It's the same system here. We're in going about relatively the same speed, a little bit slightly faster, about the same depth. But what we have here is we have the bottom, the zigzaggy bottom here must have been a little rough that day. But what we have is there's one fish here, there's another one right here. What we have, these fish are a lot closer to bottom, so you don't get that tail effect as if you would if that fish was a little bit higher. But there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's, looks like one off to the side there. So there's multiple fish here, and these fish right here, I know because I caught them. These were your 14, 17-inch fish, relatively small fish. But this is, what size, they mark in that depth of water. So that other fish that we seen a little bit ago, that was a pretty substantial fish. One thing I get asked a lot of times, or even buddies a lot of times, they're fishing in my boat. If you go back to the other slide, shows a little bit better. This slide here, a lot of people a lot of times say that are in my boat, oh, there's a fish, this blue line here, there's a bunch of fish down there. Well, these lines right here, to really get an understanding on how big something marks on your unit. Say I drop a split shot down there that's, maybe it's a 16th ounce split shot, a very small split shot. If I drop that split shot down in 16 feet of water, it's going to show up, actually pretty big. That kind of gives you an understanding on how how big something actually marks. You know, these little blue marks in here are definitely not fish. A lot of times there could just be a small particle in the water, is what your sonar is picking up. If you dropped a split shot down here, I mean, with the same sensitivity that you have, it would be a pretty decent sized line, but it wouldn't be as yellow or orange as this would be, but it would be a pretty wide line. And so these little marks right here, a lot of times are a piece of algae in the water, a little piece of clutter that's down there, just real small things that basically any of this I just ignore. Unless it has the color in it, that is, my hardest return is when I start to look and start to pay attention, like something like this, or even those smaller fish that I showed you in that last slide, like this fish. All this stuff up here is pretty much, to me, nothing. I mean, it's just small particles in the water. Those returns that start to show the same color as the hardest return at your bottom are the ones that I pay attention to. So here's another great example. This is in 40 feet of water. We have the bottom here. So basically we have 40 feet of water compressed into the same size screen. So everything is basically going to be a lot smaller than it would be, say, when we were in that 15 foot range. So this fish right here is definitely something I want to consider. It's got a lot of yellow in it, same return as my bottom. There's a lot of these other ones that are, kind of small. They're not showing a lot of color. That could mean a couple different things. Either they are smaller fish, and that's one thing I like to double check is the height of the mark. It's this fish right here is definitely a good quality fish, and same with this one. This one, it could be a fish swimming off to the side of the boat. It's got kind of the same height, but it doesn't have a lot of color in it. But a lot of these other little marks here, they could be white bass, sheephead, or other different fish. And this is out in Lake Erie. But it's one of those things that really to keep in mind the depth that you are. And right here, this I believe I was going about 1.5, almost 2 miles an hour. So these fish marks are a little bit shorter. They're up and down a lot faster than say that big mark was because I am traveling faster. But I am over top of them a little bit longer because I am in deeper water as the comb gets bigger as the deeper it travels. So there's a lot of different things to keep in mind when you're talking about how big a fish looks and comparing those things side by side. So now, picking up the speed a little bit faster, 2 miles an hour, those fish get a lot shorter, and you're not staying over top of them very long, so they get a lot shorter. And so keep in mind in all that things. And the next thing we're going to talk about is one of the things that utilize especially a lot on big bodies of water, and especially when fish are suspending, and that's high-speed graphing. And what I mean by that is driving 20, 30 miles an hour, even 40 miles an hour for that matter, and marking fish and understanding what you're marking. And what I like to do a lot of times when I'm on big bodies of water is drive around at that speed, especially on nice days, and basically zigzag around a lot on big mud flats, even structure and things like that to really cover a lot of water fast, put down a lot of waypoints, understand how big a school is, kind of graph out, basically a whole school on what it looks like, so I have an idea how many fish are in there. And what I can also do is I can go back 3-4 days later, say Lake Erie, Green Bay, or wherever. I can do the same thing. I can go through where I marked those fish at. Now what I do is I put down a different set of waypoints, a different symbol, and now I can have an understanding on which way those fish are moving, especially on open water. If it's Lake Winnebago, Green Bay, Lake Erie, wherever, anywhere on the Great Lakes when the fish go up in big schools like that, having an understanding on where those fish are moving to by simply putting a grid pattern down and putting waypoints in when I do mark fish. So I can eliminate water very fast. I can cover a lot of structure very fast. Another great tool to utilize this for is very clear water, especially like Badenoch and northern Green Bay areas where sometimes you can see 20, 30 feet down the bottom, and 99% of the time when you do go over top of those fish, they spook before your boat even gets close to them. It was actually the 2012 when I won the FLW Tour tournament up in Escanaba. It was a 3-day tournament, caught 20, 30 fish every day. Besides, the last day might have been a little bit slower, and I think I marked like 3 fish that whole tournament. I was catching fish pretty much the whole time, but what it was I could, on a calm day with sun, I could just make out bottom. I was in like 17 to 20 feet of water somewhere in there, and I could just make out bottom. It was a flat, calm day, but when there was wind, you couldn't see anything, but yet it was clear enough for those fish to still see me and spook away off to the side of the boat before my boat could even get to them. So I didn't mark hardly any fish, so I didn't have an idea if those fish were even there when I was fishing, but I knew how many fish were there by just simply driving over them very fast. They can't outrun you at 20 or 30 miles an hour. And so I have an understanding on how many fish were down there, where they were suspended in the water column, and I knew where to put my baits right away. So same with talking about this, a lot of the settings are the same. I usually back it down to -2 or -3. We have a lot of turbulence when you're going this fast. So backing off that sensitivity is very key when you start moving this fast with all that engine noise and especially when there's rough water. So everything is going to get compressed, just like you're talking about when you're talking about depth of water. Now we're talking about going 20, 30 miles an hour and compressing 20 miles an hour worth of information in a very narrow picture because you're traveling so fast. So your fish marks are going to be very straight up and down, and you're going to cover a lot of water fast. That fish might look like it's right on top of another fish when really it could be, a few hundred yards away. But you're traveling at, 20, 30 miles an hour most of the time. I mean, I've done it up to 40, 45 miles an hour. It really depends on how your boat is set up and where your transducer is placed. The biggest thing is you need to have very clean water to be running this fast and the mark very crisp. You don't want a lot of water disturbance that's going towards your transducer because it's going to clutter up your screen very fast. And this takes, this takes a little bit of time to get used to. It's not one of those things where you can just go out and do it and you're confident in it and it works. It's one of those things where the more you do it, the more you understand what you're really looking at. So what we have here is this first picture here is, we're in 20 feet of water, and I was roughly going probably about 25 miles an hour or so, I'd say, in this picture here. But what we have here is, like I said, I have my negatives, my sensitivity backed off a little bit. I still have some clutter in the screen here, and this is that turbulence and clutter that I'm talking about, so it's very important to back down. You'll see in some of the slides where I do back it off to -3 or so. What I have here is basically, going over a piece of structure. So I have a lot of jagged areas because I'm traveling fast. This looks like a very small piece of structure that I went over top of here, but at 25 miles an hour, you cover a lot of water fast. And so it looks like it went up, straight down, and boom, I'm right across right away. But this is a pretty decent size little hump that I went over here. But so what we're following here is basically the bottom. And the one I want to pick out that's the easiest to show would be this one right here. Let me try focusing in a little bit better. Would be this fish right here. So now with going at over 20 miles an hour, everything is super condensed and you're not over those fish for very long. So basically all it marks is just a very tall, or not very tall, but very narrow band or very narrow line that it shows. And same with talking about going a lot slower, I always like to keep in mind how tall that mark is. And you can see this fish right here is pretty tall. It almost covers a foot and a half of water column here with our legend that we're looking at over here. So it looks like a very tall fish. It has a lot of good color in it, almost the same as the bottom. So now when we start looking back towards this little hump that we went over that has all this stuff coming off of it, now we can start breaking it down and counting actually how many fish are actually on this little piece of structure. Because it looks like on here that all these fish are like almost right on top of each other, but we're going very fast. So we're covering a lot of water, and these fish are probably spread out a little bit, not right on top of each other like it almost shows here. What I simply did is I covered a ton of water. I back and forth over different points, did different humps and things like that. And all of a sudden, boom, I see something like this that has just a ton of fish piled up on top of it. Right away I know these fish are relating very close to bottom. They're only about a foot or two off the bottom, a lot of them. A few of them are up a little bit higher. But what it tells me right away is this hump tops out at, looks like about 14 feet or so. Simply, all I got to do if I'm trolling spinners or trolling crankbaits, I know right away what to set my baits at, because I know when it comes up to the fish are relating towards bottom. There's quite a few fish here, so right away I know that there's fish there. So now all I need to do is figure out what they're going to eat or what color that they want to eat. And right away I eliminated a ton of water very fast. I simply put my cursor, if it's a touchscreen unit, I just touch it right on those fish right there. Hit a waypoint. If it's your keypad unit, just scroll over here, hit your waypoint button twice, put in a waypoint, simply turn back around, and then make a trolling pass, or I can cast to them, or I can throw bobbers at them, or anything like that. So it's one of those things where you cover water very fast, and I know when I am fishing, I'm fishing right on top of fish. I'm not guessing. Are they there? Should I keep going? Should I? I'm not second guessing myself, trying to figure out what I should do. Here's another great example. Here I'm going just a little bit slower. I can tell that because I'm starting to get some of the tails that show up on some of the fish here. And I have basically a lot of turbulence in the water here. It was pretty rough, I can tell, just because of how much turbulence is going down in the water column here. But simply what I did here is it was a small little area. There's a pot of fish here and a couple fish lingering off over here. I simply put a fish waypoint in to understand that on my graph that it was a fish that I marked is what I used. And I put a little waypoint on these fish right here to show that other band of fish, because they'll show up actually quite a bit further on your graph apart than what they look on this picture that you have here. So right away I put down 2 separate waypoints, and I like to keep my waypoints separate when I'm putting in waypoints for fish marked compared to fish caught, so I can really distinguish where I am marking fish and where I am catching them at, because a lot of times that is two different parts of the school. So here's another great example of when fish start to suspend a little bit higher. These fish are kind of spread out, but it happens a lot of times. These fish don't have as much color in them as I'd like to see a lot of times, but this was, I'm pretty sure this was Badenoch as well, and these were walleyes, and this is what I typically see a lot of times when you're in clear water, is fish grouping up like this in little packs. Leech Lake, I seen this a lot last year when we were there. They're at least in 3 to 7, 8 to school or so. But this is just basically a pack of fish that are down there. You got a few of them that are either split up over here, but I don't know, for whatever reason I'm at -2. So these fish should have showed up a little bit better. Maybe they're off to the side of the cone or so, but this is another example. It's showing me these fish are slightly off the bottom. So right away I need to keep my baits up a little bit higher off bottom than I typically would if they were relating to bottom. So I know that there's not any fish, super high in the water column, because a lot of times you will mark fish up in this 10-foot area because you are running over them at 20, 30 miles an hour. They can't outrun the boat that fast a lot of times, so you will mark fish up here a lot of times. And that's what it's very useful for, is when those fish suspend very high, because you typically won't ever mark them, especially in any kind of water clarity, anything above, say, 10, 12 feet. Seems like those fish typically spook before you have a chance to go over them. Another great tool that this is for is using it to find bait. We have a lot of, basically it looks like a lot of weeds or something growing on the bottom, but I remember this day, it was a flat, calm day. I can see the, water's pretty flat up here, and same with on the bottom here, but I was actually driving back to the boat landing on Green Bay. And I was going about 40 miles an hour or so, and I marked this. And I'm like, it's 17 feet of water. Typically that time of year we're fishing 25 to 40 feet of water. And I marked a bunch of this down there, slowed down right away, and what this was, big schools of shad and alewives that were still unshallow yet. And typically that time of year they're already out deeper. So what I did is I slowed down, I started grafting around a little bit. Actually see in this picture right here, this might be a fish amongst the bait here, because it's a very tall mark compared to all these little blotches that are in here. And I pretty much fished this school of fish after I grafted out. I fished them for about 4 or 5 days and caught a lot of fish, about 30, 40 fish days, no problem. And it was just one of those things. I was just driving back to the boat ramp, and I was paying close attention to my electronics, and boom, I seen this, a ton of bait down there. I slowed down to reassure what I was marking, grafted out, took a pass through it. There was no one fishing within miles of me, because typically that time of year there's not fish in that shallow. But the bait was holding up in there, and there was still a ton of fish in there, but I found that bait very easily, going that fast as well. Here's another great example of bait balls that are higher up in the water column. This is a lot smaller bait. That last slide, those shad and those alewives are actually pretty big. They're like 8 to 10 inches or so. But this is just big schools of just little balls of bait, marked at basically 40 miles an hour. So very fast, but these are big, dense schools of bait. Typically a lot smaller bait shows up, very dense like those ones are there, because they are a lot closer together, almost marking one big fish. So it's a great tool to find bait. Now this is a great screenshot that I like to show to really kind of get an idea of what I do a lot of times when I'm out there on big bodies of water, big pieces of structure. What I have here is a bunch of separate trails. It's kind of hard to understand, but what I like to do a lot of times, you see basically these lines, I make a turn. A lot of times if it's rough water, I try going with the waves, or I try, just if I'm going slow, forward 15, 20 miles an hour in some really big waves or something like that, I simply turn around to get the best picture by just going nice and slow, 15, 20 miles an hour with those big waves. Like I see in here, I turned around, basically made a pass or so you would say at 20 miles an hour, or whatever speed it may be, and just kind of zigzagged all over through these fish right here. When I did mark a fish, I dropped a fish waypoint. And this is a couple separate days, as you can see, a couple different colors here, but I put fish waypoints down, I mark fish, and when I do catch fish, I drop down basically a different icon. It doesn't matter what it is. This particular time it was the little blue dots or even some music signs here. What I actually found by simply just zigzagging around looking for fish, I actually found a little rock hump that was out in this mud flat that I never knew was there as well. So it's one of those things where you're kind of doing basically covering a ton of water fast, finding fish, finding structure. You see here, there's a school of fish over here I didn't even touch, but there's a little pot of fish out here. There's a few fish waypoints under there, but there's a nice, really tight pot of fish there. I went back through and caught 3 fish very fast, and I remember this day I was all by myself pre-fishing a tournament, so I covered a lot of water fast, but I kept my waypoint separate by, changing symbols, so I understood what I was doing down there.
Is that the one I beat you at?
No, this wasn't that one. No. You might have got lucky on that one. That one sucked. What? No, I don't remember which one that was. 2 years ago, I know that. I don't remember which one it was, but yeah. You got me back last year at Devil's Lake. But anyone have any questions so far on that high-speed reading or anything like that? Yes?
Have you been able to utilize chirp at high-speed scanning, and if so, do you have to have a TM150 for that?
TM150.
The Airmar, like a true chirp transducer versus
Oh, no.
just the 83.
No.
Have you got into the chirp at all?
Yep, I've used a chirp before without that transducer you're talking about. Only uses 2 frequencies instead of 3. A lot of times what happens you can use chirp with a standard transducer. Works the same. So now with chirp, which I'll talk about a little later, chirp uses 2 frequencies at the same time. Reads them at the same time, puts them in your unit, and it prints them off of one screen, so you kind of have the best of both worlds. What it allows you to do is use less power, which clears up your screen, makes your screen a lot clearer, and has a lot better target separation than just a standard 200 kilohertz or a standard 83. So it gives you the best of both worlds for both of them printed off in one picture, which I have some slides later. But I've used it with the chirp.
You high-speed scan?
Yep.
Is with chirp?
These pictures are from with the 200 kilohertz, as you see on the bottom there. But no, last year I did it with chirp.
Right. I noticed that your color line also is at 84. Do you change your color line often?
Nope, I leave it right where it's at. I think it's at 76 a lot of
I
times.
said it was 84.
Yeah, I don't mess with my color line at all.
On the slide it said 84.
And like you can see here, I have through-hole transducers and I have skimmer transducers, and pretty much all the time when I'm trying to run high speed, I always use my skimmer transducer. It uses a lot less power and it has a lot less clutter, and a lot of times you're not getting the vibration from your boat, you're not shooting through your hull. It's, basically I put it in the cleanest spot I can on my boat, which a lot of times is the lowest spot, but you need to make sure you keep it away from, away from more than a foot of your, basically the prop water that's coming towards your boat to not affect that. But you want to keep it away from any chines or any stringers that are in your boat to keep the disturbance down. Because that's what gives you this very clear picture that you have here is having no turbulence, near that transducer that's creating air bubbles or any turbulence vibration-wise. Any other questions on any of that? Yep.
Also at like Devil's Lake, it's got so much algae and stuff. Do you just turn down your sensitivity, or like how do you set yours up when you go to these lakes that are really dirty and your screen's so cluttered?
Yeah, so you kind of have to balance that because you're going to need to keep enough power where you can penetrate through that stuff, where it's not showing a weak signal when it does get down there. So typically if it's dirty water like algae, Winnebago does the same thing where it gets a lot of algae in it. I simply just back it off to 3 at most. I never go more than 3 for negative 3 on the sensitivity, but you kind of got to balance that between, you need power to shoot through all that stuff, to shoot through that clutter, and sometimes you just have to deal with it sometimes where you have some clutter in there, but you just got to understand, the difference that if you're running more power, penetrates through and marks those fish the way that you want them to. Instead of, if you back that sensitivity down, a lot of times on fish, you don't show that deep color that you would, that hard return because you're backing off that power so much. Any other questions, anything, before I get in the structure scan? Yes?
So, whenever you're going about 20, the only 2 settings you have is that always at 200 kilohertz on your sonar, and you probably just have a map on another.
Yep, so if I'd be doing this here, I'd have my screen split. Typically, if I'm on plane, I'm not utilizing structure scan or down scan. I would have a split right here. I'd have my mapping unit on this side, and I'd have my 2-dimensional sonar on this side, or if it's Great Lakes. A lot of times, if I'm just doing a lot of open water fishing, I just split them up between the 2. I might run a full mapping. I always like to compare down scan with 2-dimensional sonar a lot of times, especially when I'm trolling, to understand if there's sheephead down there, if there are walleyes or different things like that. Any other questions? Yeah, so any other, so you have your sensitivity that you can back down, you can change. I never mess with the color line. If you go in advanced here, you have scroll speed. I always keep my scroll speed to the max. I don't mess with any of that. The only thing I really ever mess with on my two-dimensional sonar is my sensitivity, and that's it. And the Lowrance does a pretty good job at keeping everything about where it needs to be most of the time. So now getting into structure scan. It's one of those things where, this is where we start getting into where you can really start to understand really what is going on down there. It paints a very clear picture, and it allows us to cover a lot more water faster, going slow and really a detailed picture. So to understand this, it utilizes a different frequency, which paints a little bit different picture. That higher frequency penetrates water a lot better, and that's why it runs a little bit different frequency. So it runs a 455 or an 800. Typically, if I'm running any kind of side scan, I'm always running 455. It shows up a better picture on side scan. The 800 a lot of times shows a better picture on strictly down scan, but most of the time, say 90% of the time, I'm running 455 just because I'm running both of them at the same time. And there's not really a big difference between the two unless you're trying to do 800 kilohertz on side scan is definitely not as clear. So this down scan, it paints a very clear picture on exactly what is going on down there. It kind of eliminates a lot of the guesswork on what two-dimensional sonar is showing. It has a very narrow cone angle, so it doesn't cover a lot of water, which allows it to paint that very clear picture because it's not showing something way in front of the boat, way in back of the boat. It's just strictly what's right under the boat, and it shows that return coming straight back up to it. So when you're marking fish, you're not going to mark this big sweeping tail. You're going to mark basically exactly what that fish looks like straight under your boat. And so it's great for structure fishing. It's great for kind of understanding. A lot of times even Great Lakes fishing, or when you got a lot of sheephead or white bass, they know what fish are underneath your boat. The walleyes are going to mark like a stick because it's going to show exactly what that fish looks like. Basically, if it's a more round fish like a white bass or a sheephead, you can tell the difference on down scan. The same way when you're going slow. So it's one of those things where it kind of eliminates guesswork on structure as well as fish. Well, the same with two-dimensional sonar, the auto features. I really don't mess with the contrast. Contrast would be the sensitivity term for structure scan. I usually leave it on the auto feature for that. But the biggest thing that separates structure scan, especially when it comes to moving the boat, is structure scan works very well slow. At say less than 5 miles an hour. That's when it paints the very clear picture. Typically, when I'm doing structure scan, it's around that 3 miles an hour range. When I start to get on the structure, then I slow down to say 2 miles an hour. But the faster you go, the more compressed it gets, because just like two-dimensional sonar, but it's a very narrow band. So it gets even more compressed than say two-dimensional sonar was because it's not covering very much. So like I showed you this slide before, your traditional sonar is this big cone here, shows a lot of different things, which is not always a good thing. A down scan is just a very narrow band. So it paints a very clear picture. It goes, off to the side of the boat, more than it goes out to the front or the back of the boat does. So this is that same picture I showed you guys earlier. This big sweeping fish mark here. It looks like a pretty big fish because it is. I got, pretty good height in here. We have these big, long sweeping effects. Now when we get in the side scan, or down scan, this is basically the same version, just straight below the boat. Now with down scan, it's that very narrow band, so it's not going to pick up the front of the fish and the back of the fish, tailing off the cone. This is that same fish, and this is what that fish looks like on down scan. Now on this color palette, which is color palette 6, which I typically like to run most of the time because color palette 6 is one of those palettes where the hardest return here is basically this white or this off-white color, but it fades into the brown and a lighter white into the brown, which a lot of the colors don't do in the different color palettes. If it's the blue one, it either shows blue or black, and that's it. Where this color palette 6, you'll kind of see the differences in contrast. The hardest return is white, showing a little bit harder bottom here. And the same thing when we talk about side scan. But what I'm going to show you here is this fish. So it's painting exactly what that fish looks like. This is the same fish. This is my bottom unit. The other unit that I showed you was my top unit. And so I'm comparing the same fish, side by side, and this is what down scan looks like. And so I'm pretty much going to go over down scan, and I'll start to get on the side scan here. But just a quick little pointer on side scan. This is basically, I'll just go through it right away because this is a great example. So now on side scan, this is what we have here is this would be the top of the water column. This line going down the middle right here, this is up here, the top of the water column by the boat. is this white line going down here. Now on the Lowrance, it scrolls from the bottom and it scrolls up. So this is what's right under the boat now, and this is what was before. So what I have here is, right here is basically the boat where the transducer is. Off to the right here, this black here, is basically the water column, the same water column I have here. Same thing off to the left-hand side. This black area in here goes from the boat, boom, this is bottom. Same with on the right side of the boat, this is where my bottom would be. Now what I have here is this same fish mark that I have here also got picked up, on my side scan. I can compare the two a lot of times to tell whether or not, maybe the fish is off to this side of the boat more than it is off to the other side of the boat. And a lot of times, this narrow band straight below the boat, it might not pick up a fish, but I can see like this particular fish right here. It picked up on the right side of the boat, where it didn't pick up on the left side of the boat, so it must have been off to the other side of the boat. A lot of times you'll catch fish that you did typically mark straight under the boat, as well on side scan, that are showing them off the bottom just as if they would. This is the same picture right here, only it's over here. It's shooting off to the side of the boat. So this will be the bottom, this would be the bottom on the left side, this is the right side. I might as well go through all this with you because it's a great shot. Like I was talking about with that color palette 6, is it has those different color changes. So like I said, the bottom or the hardest return, sand, rocks, and different things are going to be your white return. So now I look over here on the left side of my boat. This is my legend I have here. 20 feet over the left side of the boat. So this is always matches my depth that I'm in. Right here. And so I got 20 feet over on this side of the boat, 40, 80 feet. So now I look over here, I have all this white area that goes for, looks like about 20 feet or so. So this is all a little bit harder bottom band. I look over to the right side of my boat, and I really don't see much that. I see a little bit of a band right here of white, very close to the boat, not very wide, and as soon as it fades off, it gets a lot darker. And the darker return is a weaker signal, which is going to mean mud, lighter sand, mud mix, and not rock. So what I have here is a lot more muddy area on the right-hand side. It must be a brake line or something right here that's got a hard bottom band to it. So that's one thing to keep in mind with same with this is your bottom color, because that's going to dictate how hard your return is. So now this slide here shows a great picture. This isn't my slide, but it's a great example of how clear that your downscan actually is. So I can see here we're in about 32 to 30 feet of water. I look here up to the top of this mark here is basically about 15 feet or so from the bottom here. This is basically a 15-foot bush that's under the water. I can count every branch that's on this thing, not so much on this picture. On some of the other ones, you can count almost every branch on them. But what you wouldn't have seen on two-dimensional sonar would be these 4 fish that are laying right at the base of this tree. Because two-dimensional sonar is going to mark one big blob. It's going to hide a lot of these fish that are in here because it's going to show this big blob, because your transducer is going to mark it coming at this angle. It's going to mark it straight over top of it, and it's going to mark it again here and basically blur all this into one big picture like you have on this picture here. This is a great example of your two-dimensional sonar basically marking a big blob of, it's tough to tell what it even is. Look on this side on downscan, I can see there's a fallen down tree down there. These are the big limbs here, and have a bunch of different branches that break off of it. So it paints a very clear picture on exactly what's going on down there. This one's a little bit fuzzy on here, it's a little bit tougher to see. But what you have is, very broad cone angle, shows a lot of different things and clutters it all together. And, a very narrow band that paints a very clear picture of what's going on down there. So now on this shot here, this is a great example. You can see that it says I'm in 11.8 feet, which is, right about here, somewhere here or so. What it actually is this is basically weeds that I have here. This bottom is actually about down here where this yellow line shows, so it's kind of fooling my electronics because these weeds are so thick here. So I have, basically a foot and a half of weed growth that I have here. Got some taller strands that stick up here. And as I look over here, it looks like a little bit taller patch, and who knows what's coming up here. It's hard to tell. These might be some smaller fish. Now I look over here on downscan, side by side, I can see the bottom is right here. I have the same weed growth. I can see almost every stalk of these weeds. Now looking up here, I can obviously tell that this isn't weeds because it's not connected to this. And what this is, each little mark I have here is a bluegill. So one of the lakes I have back home, Green Lake, it's a very clear lake. And this is a school of bluegills that we fish a lot of times. So it paints a very clear picture. I can almost count how many bluegills are on this screenshot here, where this is what it looks like on two-dimensional sonar, just kind of a blob, and maybe you can make out what those fish are, but these are about 7.5 to maybe 8-inch bluegills here. And so it paints that very clear picture. It doesn't have a lot of guesswork. You can see that there's fish down there, there's dots down there. That it really eliminate all that guesswork. Well, this is a great shot as well. This is a school of baitfish on downscan. You see the school of baitfish on two-dimensional sonar. It actually didn't pick it up very well at all. This must have been off to one side of the cone. Maybe it's slightly off to the one side, and definitely on two-dimensional sonar, it didn't pick it up where it moved before it had a chance. It almost looks like it swam away. But what it is here is, it wasn't right under the boat, or it wasn't right under the boat, obviously, because this didn't pick it up. Must have been slightly off to the side of the boat. So this is one of those examples where I was talking about one might pick something up that the other one doesn't. And understanding those cone angles can help you understand why that might happen. And what you can see here is we got a couple fish here. They almost blended together. Here on downscan, we can see those two separate fish, plain as day. What we have here is another fish, marked pretty well on our two-dimensional sonar, but it didn't really mark at all on our downscan. You can kind of see a little glimpse of it here. That fish must have been, swimming through that school, or, it might have been off to the side where it didn't get marked on downscan, but it did on two-dimensional sonar. So it's one of those things where they can sneak through, each sonar band a little bit differently and pick up on one better than the other. But this paints that very clear picture of, two fish chasing a school of bait, or three fish when that one's marked. But you can see down here, we got some small fish down here. It's marking a couple over here and not over here. So it's one of those things where, understanding that cone angle really helps you understand, why, this one's marking them and the other one isn't. So now I'm kind of getting into more side scan. Now this is into, using the side scan is where you can really pick apart a piece of structure, find small structures very fast, and finding those key areas, immediately. Now what we have here is the same thing I talked about earlier. This is our down scan on this side now. This is the water column, this is bottom. It's the same thing here. We're only at 9 feet of water, so it's pretty close to basically your boat or the top of the water column. Now, same thing, this 9 feet that's showing right here is going to be the distance right here. This is where it's printing and scrolling this way. So I actually just came off a plane right here. This is on the Lake Winnebago system. And what I did is I just simply idle along here. I have the hardest return, boom, this is bottom off to the right. This is bottom off to the left. Now as I move up towards here, I can see a disturbance that's down there. I can see a bunch of dots and a bunch of round little things. What I see here is this big black area that's right behind it. One thing I like to talk about, using structures or side scan is, almost like using a flashlight. So if I shine a flashlight towards those three chairs over there, it's going to show up those three chairs, very bright, but behind them it's not going to show anything. It's going to be a dark shadow. That's the same thing with side scanning. It's not going to penetrate that piece of structure, so it's not going to show what's behind it. It's going to show a shadow. So what I have here is basically what this is a dump truck full of rock on Lake Winnebago. It's an artificial reef. I can see here that, using my legend down here, it's pretty narrow. It looks like about, 30 feet wide or so, or 30 feet this way. So it's relatively very small, only a little bit bigger than the boat. What I have here is it has, quite a bit of a white return or a harder return on this way, on the face of it. As it shoots over the top of it, it's not as bright because either it's going down or it's at the same level, but I have this big shadow behind it, which is telling me that it must have came off the bottom to show that big shadow. So the shadow is always kind of the thing that you double check whether or not you're marking something that came off the bottom, or even a fish for that matter. On side scan, you just kind of think about a flashlight when you shine it at something. Shining at this big rock pile, you're not going to see what's behind it. So simply all I need to do here on side scan is I never drove over top of this rock pile right here. I can simply take my touchscreen unit or a keypad unit, hit the cursor right on top of this here, hit a waypoint twice, simply turn around, drop my bow mount in, and I can flip jigs on top of that. I can cast crankbaits over top of it, throw bobbers at it. I know pretty much right where it's at by using my GPS, by never going over top of it. So it helps you find small pieces of structure. Because I'm covering, at this particular area, I'm covering 80 feet off to the right, 80 feet off to the left, so 160 feet in one swath. But one thing to keep in mind is that when you're using side scan, is that when you turn, you're going to distort one picture compared to the other side. Because say you're running your side scan, you're putting out a cone off both sides. Now when you start turning over, say you're turning to the left, you're basically sending that same cone, that same signal in the same area over and over again. It's going to get very distorted and basically almost be a worthless picture on the side that you're turning on your inside corner. The outside now is going to speed up, which is going to paint a good picture yet, but everything's going to be a little bit faster because you're turning fast. And so it's going to still mark a clean picture on that side, but the one side is going to be a little bit messed up and show a very blurry picture. So always keep in mind when you're using side scan that turning affects the picture that it's painting. And when you want to go towards something or want to understand something, going in a straight line is the best thing to do for as long as you can and turn around and take another good shot at it. So it's one of those things where it's very easy to find little pieces of structure in that National Walleye Tour Championship at Lake Winnebago. I mean, this is the stuff I was fishing. I marked out a ton of these in practice, and I just had a milk run that I hit every day. I pick off a fish here and there on, one or two fish. A lot of times it was every 5th to 10th rock pile I'd finally get a fish or so, but it was a very tough bite, and it ended up, taking enough to win the tournament. But I was fishing very small key areas, and that's how I found them. They're not on a lake map. They're not on any charts or anything like that. They're just scattered throughout there. They put them on top of the ice, and they fall through, and you have to basically look for them. So it's one of those things where you can find things that other people can't, find those secret small spots, and understand what's going on down there. Now this is a great picture of Devil's Lake, great example of a road that's down there. So I went over a little crooked here. I didn't go 90 degrees to it. What I can see over here off to the right-hand side of the boat is I can see this, basically riprap area that's on the side of the road. I can't see it on the other side because it goes down. It creates a big shadow, but I can see the smooth area on top of it here. Looking over here, it's the same thing where I have this riprap area, and it must be coming up here as it's getting harder, and you have this smooth area here. So this is basically going over top of the side of the road. This here is basically going right alongside a rock break line. I can see here that this rock break line is relatively narrow. It looks like I look down here, 20 feet here. I looked at about 50 there, so about 30 feet. 30 feet worth of rock right there, very narrow band. But what this also allows me to do is I can see it on the side of my grapple. And now when it comes time to trolling, say I'm trolling lead core, or if I'm trolling, bottom bouncers right over the side of the boat, what this is going to allow me to do is tell whether or not, say I'm right on top of this structure now, I'm just going alongside of it, really understanding what it's showing here. At the hard bottom is that whiter return like I talked about earlier, so it's showing a hard bottom compared to this little bit darker area or softer bottom. That looks like little soft or little hard spots that are showing up throughout here. I look over top on the other side of the cone here on the left side of the boat. I have a lot of dark black areas for the most part. It looks like some little mud divots out there. It's a lot of mud bottom. It's showing a very weak return compared to this other side. Now what this allows me to do is say if I'm trolling right over top of this rock and I'm showing it right under my boat, it's going to show up on this side of my boat, maybe a slightly 10, 15 feet on this side, and show up on this side. So now when that starts to fade off on one side, starts getting closer to this side of the boat, or basically closer towards the bottom here, it's telling me that it's starting to go over the right side, because the right side is going to show a little bit more. So now when I'm trolling, I know right away I need to turn a little bit to the right. And I'm basically trying to keep this, or the brake line, or any kind of transition line even on this side, and even on this side, to know I'm right on top of it, and obviously I'll see it right under the boat. What it allows me to do is right away I know which way I need to turn when it starts to fade away from one side, and starts to fade and get more of it on the other side. I'll still be marking under here, but it slowly goes away, and I don't know which way to go. Well, utilizing the side scan, I know right away, all right, boom, there's more of it on this side, I need to turn to the right. Keep my baits or spinners right on top of that brake line. So, talking about most of that structure, I use side scan about 90% of the time for structure. I don't utilize it much for marking fish. That's what I use downscan and two-dimensional sonar for, but I use it mostly for structure. But this is a great example right here of what fish actually look like on side scan. So I have, same, top of the water column here. Boom, this is the water column, this is where bottom hits. And what I have over here is I can see there's one streak here, there's one streak right behind it, but then I have another streak, just above it here. Now what I want to do to double check that is I have the white return, it's a harder return than the hardest return, it shows up in that white streak, but I have this little black line right behind it, which is the shadow of the fish. And I can see that this black line is slightly behind it a little bit here, which is telling me that fish is slightly off the bottom. Now if I look at these fish right here, there's a it looks like, I'm not sure how many, 2 or 3 of them, probably about 3 of them laying all right next to each other. But the shadow on these fish are right behind it. So these fish must be belly to the bottom, just laying there. Where this fish right here is definitely maybe 6 inches to a foot, not sure, off the bottom, because the shadow is further behind it. When it's right behind it, when those fish are right on bottom, it's going to be right behind it. The higher they get up, the more that shadow is going to be further away from the boat. So this is a very clear picture of what fish look like, and typically it takes your very smooth bottom. If you're marking a lot of rocks, it's hard to distinguish big rock white blobs compared to fish ones. So it's kind of hard to mark fish a lot of times unless it's a very flat, sandy or muddy area. So like the same picture here, I have basically a transition area. This is a transition right here, where it goes from light or harder return to a darker return. So these fish are just hanging off in the mud on the side of this break line or shoreline, whatever this is, because this side right here has a lot more harder bottom, harder sand. It doesn't look like there's much rock in there. It's either hard sand or hard gravel, and the fish are just hanging off on the mud side. But it's only really easy to see fish when there's either a smooth surface on the bottom. This picture actually here is the Mississippi River. What I have here is, I can see I got a shadow behind it here. There's probably a log laying down here and a bunch of debris that's down there. And it must be a little depression right on the back side of it there where I was marking that shadow. I got some clutter going on right here. I'm not sure if it's some logs or something down there as well. I got a little bit of a hard bottom area here before it fades off. Not much on this side. But here's another great picture of what fish look like. Here's a little white streak here. It has a hard return because it's a fish. I have the shadow right directly behind it. The same with these other 2 ones right here. Got a little faint little line with the shadow behind it. These ones are hard to tell. When it comes into wood and different rocks and things, it can be hard to tell whether or not you're looking at fish. That's why I don't utilize it a lot of times for marking fish. I utilize it more for structure than trying to find fish, because you have stuff a lot of times like, is this a rock or is this a fish? Same with that one. It can be hard to tell when you get around structure. So I utilize it mostly for structure fishing than anything else. Now here's another great example talking about the same thing. I don't have any kind of rock or anything on this picture here. What I can see here, it looks like just basically almost the same as the bottom. All of a sudden, boom, there's a big shadow behind it. Well, that tells me right away that there must have been a pretty steep drop off, or this must be a slight hump right here. Simply scroll the waypoint over, hit a waypoint in here. If you look at this side, looks like something's going on here, but this actually is the shoreline. It comes out of the water, is why it's showing black here. It's right on the edge of a shoreline. So it's one of those things where it helps paint a very clear picture of what's going on down there. Here's another great example of what rocks look like. I have a lot of decent sized rocks down here. It looks like a bunch of smaller ones down in this area here. What I have here, kind of have a gap in the structure here. Almost a little pocket that's in here. This is a pretty big rock. Now, if I go back to my legend I have down here, 20, 40, 60, 80 feet over here. If I take this 20 feet, I'd put that rock right about in here. That rock's about 15 feet across. So it's very easy to find that key spot on that structure. The biggest rocks, that hold generally bigger walleyes, smallmouth bass, or anything like that, and a little bit difference in the structure that you're fishing. I got these big rocks here. I got a little pocket here. This would be a spot I'd want to waypoint, because I got a lot of smaller rocks. They're not as big rocks over here, but this is something definitely different on a piece of structure. A big rock, got a nice little, basically flatter area with not as many rocks in the middle of it. This is going to be an area I'm going to want to check. It's going to be that spot on a piece of structure. It's not dull and gradual like this side is. This is obviously just one piece of the structure, but this is something, I'd always want to, waypoint, and I want to put down in my notes what is down there. Because this is something for bass or walleye fishing that you're going to want to cast to, pitch jigs to, or something like that, because it's going to be that spot where fish hold up on it, because it is something different than the rest of the structure. So now this example here is not mine, it's one of Lawrence's, but it shows a pretty distorted picture on here. But I have a school of bait fish with a bunch of different dots, and I can very easily see, what is down there. I can see the windows, the doors, and whatever, and so it shows a nice clean picture of what's going on down there. And that's one of the things about structure scan that really eliminates the guesswork on what is going on down there. Does anyone have any questions on structure scan before I move on? Yes.
Down imaging?
Yep.
Can you tell which side of the boat the fish is on or not?
Only thing you can tell with down imaging is if you have side imaging going on right next to it on the same screen, whether or not one side is picking up more than the other.
Down imaging won't tell you, just down imaging won't tell you what is where.
No, it's the same thing as this picture right here. So this picture is showing you, what's directly under the boat. That's showing you, it's a longer cone. Now to double check, say if I want to say what side of the fish this is on, it's going back to this right here. So this is your side scan right alongside of it. Well, this fish right here is marking on both sides, so it must be pretty directly under the boat. Now, say, this fish that I'm marking here wasn't on both sides, it was like this one right here. I'm just catching, some of the fish. It might not be as bright and vibrant as that one, but it's off on this side, like this is here, and not on this side. Then right away I know that fish is more on that side of the boat than it is on the other side. That's the only way to really tell on down scan or even two-dimensional what side of the boat that they are on. Any other questions? Yes?
How the kilohertz?
Typically it's generally 99% of the time it's 455 is what they're on. There's 455 and there's 800. 800 is a little bit clearer for down scan. If you're going to utilize any side scan, 455 is definitely way better than 800 on the HD versions of the transducers. Any other questions? So I'm just going to go over real quick on some of the newer technologies that are all, we kind of talked about chirp just for a second there. What chirp is basically it's a compressed high intensity radar pulse. So it utilizes many different frequencies at the same time, puts them in your unit, and returns them back into one image. So it utilizes multiple different frequencies, which give you the best of both worlds throughout. Most Lowrance, Hummingbird, and other units as well are going to chirp just because it's giving you that more crisp, clear picture, better target separation. This is a decent picture here. The sensitivity is definitely a little too high, but this is what it's showing you here. You can definitely scale down the sensitivity here, but I have a little bit better target separation. The next slide shows it better, as these fish aren't all blobbed together as bad as they would have been typically on two-dimensional. The sensitivity is definitely way too high. If it was backed off, it'd show a lot better, but this is what chirp looks like when it's set up right. You have a very clean picture. The fish marks, this is just a zoomed-in version. Fish marks are very clear. There's not a lot of disturbance going on down there where it's going to be blobbed together. It has better target separation. You can use less power, show a better image. Same with this picture here, showing a bunch of fish piled together. It's a little bit easier to distinguish. It's not a fix-all, but it's definitely something that shows up a little bit clearer. Now, I'm talking about another thing that I like to utilize is anyone ever heard of Insight Genesis by Lowrance? It's a very cool feature. It's a separate membership, but what it allows you to do is on your Lowrance graphs, it allows you to record information. So basically all this sonar that you drive over top of, it records into an SD card. You go into your unit, you put an SD card into there, you go into a couple different features, and then you go into a log sonar. So now once you start to log your sonar, now it's logging all that depth recordings that you are basically driving over top of. What it does is it creates a recording onto that SD card. When you're done with that SD card at the end of the day, you take it out of your unit, you plug it into your computer, you go on insightgenesis.com, it's a subscription where you don't even have to have the subscription to view them, you just have to have the subscription to load them on your unit. But what you have is basically your own lake chart that shows exact depths of everything that you recorded in your own time. So what it is basically it compiles. It can do 1 foot contours, 3 foot contours. It can do different bottom hardnesses, from hard bottom to soft bottom, and different shadings. But what I have here is just a very interesting picture I like to show. This is simply just about 3 trolling passes on Green Bay on one of my spots I like to fish. Just one trolling pass. It utilizes your down scan, and it utilizes side scan and your two-dimensional sonar, so it's getting a very broad picture. So what I have here is basically one trolling pass. They're kind of right over top of each other, but this width right here is the reading that you're getting, so it's quite a good distance. Same with here. This is the reading that you're going to get, so it's not just a narrow band. So this was about 3 or 4 trolling passes. I turned around, I came back around, and I did another one, and these are different trails here. What I have here is, right here is when I actually left. So this Insight Genesis records information below 20 miles an hour. So right here is when I took off and left, and I was over 20 miles an hour, and I quit recording. And it records, if you want to record bottom hardnesses from hard to rock sand transitions and things like that, it needs to be under 5 miles an hour. What I have here is a very detailed map of 1 foot contours of these tiny little humps that I was fishing that aren't on any Navionics ship or any Lake Master or anything like that, but I have my own lake maps that were compiled from my own information that I know is 100% correct. I can see these very small little humps. Now this is just a trolling pass. Now if I would go back over top and do a grid pattern, I'd have the whole big picture mapped out, kind of like I have here. This is Lake Winnebago system. It's actually under one of the bridges, and there is no lake trip that comes even close to any of the stuff on Lake Winnebago, especially around some of the bridges. But what I have here is I have, it's a little bit tough to see up there. It does color shading, but this is all 1 foot contours under this bridge. Because you got the higher spots of some of the pillars that are under there. And a lot of these are rock humps that, were old existing pillars used to be that is now away from the new bridge. So this is one of those things where you can compress your own information. If it's one of your favorite spots, you can simply graph over. All I did here is idle through this bridge. It's a pretty wide bridge. Back and forth through this bridge, and this is the picture I got after I loaded it in my computer. It's one of those cool little features that you're already out driving around, you're already out fishing. Why not save that information onto an SD card, plug it in your computer, and you have this information for the rest of your life. And simply all you need to do now is if I wanted to put this on my unit, I'd have to have this subscription. I believe it's $99, and I could load this back on the SD card after it was loaded into my computer, and it was sent back to me from Lawrence. It usually comes back within a couple hours. Put it back on the SD card, plug it back into my unit, load it in my unit, and I can have it overlaid right on top of my lake map that's already on my unit. And it shows me, exactly what I have here, and what I can keep doing is on your computer you keep merging trips, more and more trips from the same body of water, and it keeps putting them all into one map, and you can just keep building onto this more and more and more. So it's one of those cool features that you can really learn a lake that has, relatively no lake maps that are worth anything on it, and to really understand, the spots that you fish a lot. So I know we're getting a little bit long here, but so, I thank all you guys for coming today here, and I hope you guys can take a little bit of information from this. I know it's a lot of information fast, but it's kind of one of those things where you have to have the understanding of the whole big picture on how everything works to understand, the different features and how to utilize them. So, hard water season is just about to leave, and soft water is here. So I hope you can remember a few things and take a few things away from this, or maybe try something on your unit that you haven't tried before. And we pay a lot for our electronics, and we always want to get the most out of them. So it's one of those things where, once you kind of have an idea of how to use them, maybe it's take you the next step to really help you explore new bodies of water. So thanks you guys all for coming here, and have a good night.
Thank you, Corey. Before you leave here, we want to give you an FM Walleyes hat, just as a little token of a thank you for coming and joining us.
Thanks.